You're listening to Myers-Briggs Question Corner with Edythe Richards.
Hello, folks. Today's episode is a re-release of a previous episode dedicated specifically to Valentine's Day and understanding a bit more about our romantic relationships from a personality perspective. This episode is a compilation of questions and answers, so please tune in. And as always, if you have a relationship question, please contact me at Edythe, that's Edythe, at atopcareer.com, and I'll be glad to feature you on an upcoming episode. A happy belated Valentine's Day to you and your special someone.
Welcome to our Valentine's Day podcast, Myers-Briggs and Relationships. I'm David, producer for this podcast, as well as the other Myers-Briggs podcasts available on the website at www.atopcareer.com. Now, I'm with Edythe Richards, Myers-Briggs Master Practitioner. This podcast is actually a follow-up to Edythe's appearance on Fairfax Radio last Valentine's Day, where she discussed, can the Myers-Briggs predict relationship success? You can find a link to that interview on Edythe's website, as previously mentioned. Now, Edythe, welcome, and thanks for discussing this very interesting topic once again.
Thanks for helping me put this together, David. It's a topic that's really interesting to anyone who's familiar with the Myers-Briggs assessment and type theory, and I'm thrilled to be discussing this.
What we've done this time is poll some of our followers and newsletter subscribers on specific relationship questions that they have. And I understand, Edythe, you'll be answering them in this forum.
That's right, so let's get to it.
Right. This first question is a good one to get the conversation started. It comes from Carla, who asks, how can the Myers-Briggs be used effectively in talking about relationships? Isn't there more to compatibility than scientific matrices? Edythe, I'm sure you've been asked this one before. What do you say to Carla and others who are talking about the Myers-Briggs as a tool in relationship development?
You're right, David. I've been asked this question many times in many different ways, and I'll start by saying that neither the Myers-Briggs nor any other test or personality measure should be used in deciding whether you should date or marry someone. Personality is such a complex topic.
It is.
And much as some people would like to believe otherwise, personality isn't quantifiable nor diagnosable, if you will. I'm actually in the process of writing a really interesting study that addresses criticisms about the Myers-Briggs, not just from a relationship point of view, but in terms of how it should and should not be used. And I'd like to encourage our listeners to be on the lookout for this on my site in the next couple of weeks.
Excellent. I'll look out for that one myself. Again, the website is www.atopcareer.com. Now, Edythe, you were saying?
So yes, there is a lot more to compatibility than scientific matrices to Carla's question. The Myers-Briggs is a binary distribution of 4 dichotomies of personality traits. In other words, each dichotomy is either A or B. So you're right, in real life, love just doesn't work this way. Successful relationships are found in all type combinations, and any 2 healthy and mature people can have a successful relationship. Now, knowing yours and your partner's Myers-Briggs type can help you gain a better understanding of yourself and your partner in terms of how your relationship plays out. And I'll surmise that this is where Carla's question is headed. The insight that's gained from a couple's interpretation can enable a deeper understanding of how people work together in a relationship, and this helps provide a foundation for better communication and interaction.
Great points, Edythe. We don't want to make the mistake of using the Myers-Briggs as a determinant or judging someone based on their 4 letters only. As we've previously said, all individuals are unique with unique struggles and perspectives.
Yes, that's so true. I myself have ENFP preferences, but that doesn't mean that I'll have the same relationship issues as other ENFPs do.
I think that's a good reminder for our listeners. Now let's go on to the next question. This one's from Ben. What are 5 strategies for introverts to engage with people at a party or event where a potential love connection could be made?
I love this question. First, let's clarify what introversion and extroversion are. There are 2 ways of getting and using energy, extroversion or E and introversion I. People who prefer extroversion tend to focus on the outside world to get energy through interacting with people and doing things. People who prefer introversion focus instead on the inner world, where they get energy through reflecting on information, ideas, experiences, or concepts. It's important to note that we all use both introversion and extroversion in our daily lives, but there's one that comes more easily and more naturally for us. In this case, I'm going to assume that Ben has a preference for introversion. Many introverts find parties and social gatherings stressful, especially if they don't know most of the people there. So meeting new people at these types of events may present their own challenges for introverts. So let's see if I can come up with 5 strategies that can help introverts to best navigate these challenges. Okay, so first I would say it's important just to be prepared. So trying to figure out ahead of time what type of social event this will be. For example, like a large party in someone's basement, or will it be a dinner party, or will it be a small type of gathering? What types of people will be there? Will it be a lot of strangers or friends of friends? Is there a theme? Is it someone's birthday? So depending on the event and the people there, you can think about topics to talk about ahead of time too. So having some potential icebreakers or conversation starters ready would be a good strategy going into this. Knowing as much as you can ahead of time can alleviate a lot of potential stressors and awkwardness. Second, if this is an option, I would say try to relax with a drink. This can make you feel less anxious, but on the flip side, of course, drinking too much can cause its own problems too.
It truly can. As an introvert myself, I have to say I've used this strategy, and it did calm me down in what I perceive to be a pretty tense situation.
Good, so it works to an extent. Third, find a task to do or offer to help the host or hostess. This little trick is a good idea for anyone who feels socially awkward or out of place. And even as an extrovert, I've used it myself. Plus, the host or hostess will probably really appreciate someone taking out the trash or making sure the hors d'oeuvres plates are full, things like that.
Okay, good one.
So a fourth one. Seek out a friendly extrovert or even someone who's alone or looks awkward. Whether they're an extrovert or an introvert, they'll probably really appreciate you coming up to them and making the first move, so to speak. This person could end up being, a love interest, but you could also make a really good friend this way too. A couple of years ago, I was at this networking event and I felt really awkward and I was just kind of standing around. And then this girl came up to me and she complimented me on my shoes and we ended up having a really cool conversation and she became a friend.
Wow, so you never know what could happen if you take a small initiative. But again, speaking as an introvert myself, it can be easier said than done.
Yes, and believe it or not, it's often true for extroverts too. Extrovert or introvert, some people just aren't smooth. So, if it works, it works. If not, just move on. There'll always be other people to talk to.
That's very true. Edythe, is there any other simple tip that would help an introvert at a social gathering?
Yes, smile. Of course, I'm speaking from an extroverted perspective here, but really, who doesn't appreciate a smile? It puts people at ease and it boosts your own confidence. Plus, I think it's something many introverts forget to do, and truly, it can make all the difference.
This is a great reminder, Edythe. Not something I would have thought to include in this list. Now let's move on to the next question. This one's a bit more specific. This one's from Tammy. My boyfriend is a borderline ISTJ, INTJ. I am an INFP, close to the E line. I can be rather clingy with my partner when I'm stressed, and he is a solitude-loving type who withdraws as a reaction to stress. That causes some friction between us. How can we make ourselves more compatible and supportive to each other in times of stress? Can you come up with an answer for this one, Edythe?
I'll surely try. Okay, there'll always be some Myers-Briggs types who value certain characteristics more than others. The obvious difference to me with this pairing is the thinking-feeling difference, and Tammy's comment about being clingy while her partner retreats is a good example of how the thinking and feeling dichotomy can play out in a relationship. So let me backtrack a little here. Thinking and feeling refers to how we make decisions. Thinkers' preference is to make decisions based on objective analysis and cause and effect logic. Feeler's preference is subjective, focusing on consensus and people involved. So Tammy says her partner is ISTJ/INTJ, which means he's using extroverted thinking, and this is about looking for facts that can be proven in the external world. This function can manifest what's seen as controlling statements or behaviors. For example, why don't you do it this way? Or you should do that instead of this. So many people who have a thinking preference see emotions as one more problem to solve, and emotions can be confusing. For extroverted thinkers, what's confusing is very stressful, and it's their natural inclination to seek order and clarity in their external environment. So one response to stress is to retreat, and in this case, where things make more sense and where they can be at ease in their own structured and organized environment to process the things that have happened in their own way, in their own minds. So I'm guessing that this might be what's happening with Tammy's boyfriend. So this way of handling stress can be very confusing and even hurtful for an INFP who values the emotional connection of the relationship above everything else. And she may take her partner's retreat as a personal insult. So Tammy's response may be to feel disconnected from her partner if he's not willing to share his personal feelings. At the same time, Tammy's partner is going to be less swayed by emotional or passionate pleas for time together. So the more clingy Tammy becomes, it's likely the more her partner will retreat.
A bit of a vicious circle. What would be a good strategy for this?
So one strategy to address this is for Tammy's partner to verbalize that he needs some time alone and give her an approximate time of when he'll come back to her. This gives him an opportunity to deal with his stress in his own way on his own timeline. I'd also recommend that he verbalize to Tammy so she knows she didn't do anything wrong and that he still loves and appreciates her. It's then going to be Tammy's job to give him his space. That's his time. So she'll need to respect his privacy and independence.
Anything else?
Another strategy is for them as a couple to have a candid conversation when they're not under stress. Tell each other truthfully but tactfully what's hurting or bothering them. Before talking, I'd say each person should take the time to think things through in terms of their own positions before sharing them openly. And then take the time to genuinely listen to each other's points of view. Tammy's partner may have trouble acknowledging or sharing his personal feelings, so she'll need to be patient with this. She also shouldn't be so concerned with skirting around the issues because most thinkers prefer a direct approach. ISTJs and INTJs will both likely appreciate their partners taking on things like household chores or managing money and will see these as a sign of affection. And obviously this is not the case for INFPs. INFPs will appreciate listening without judging, giving compliments, and emotional intimacy. So we're talking about two very different styles here. As with any relationship, viewing struggles from the point of view of your partner rather than your own point of view often leads to greater understanding and overcoming many of these relationship challenges.
I can relate to a few of these things, I have to say. I'm an INTJ myself. I don't always realize how critical I can come across to others. I certainly don't mean to. I do need my privacy, and if I don't get it, I wouldn't be able to be a good relationship partner.
It's a great point to make, and it just shows how important effective communication is in a relationship, regardless of a person's Myers-Briggs type.
Great job with answering a very difficult question, Edythe.
Thanks.
Let's move on to the next question. Susan is asking, I'm an INTP, and I've made some bad relationship choices. What are some things I can do to settle back into that reasoned, calm person I used to be, but who can make excellent choices and decisions?
In this scenario, I'm very curious about what the relationship mistakes were. My first thought was it could be related to making an impulsive choice, but INTPs aren't really known as impulsive types. In fact, in my experience, they're more likely to procrastinate. At least to an onlooker, it might look that way. In terms of relationships, what's more likely for an INTP is to resist making a move unless there's some external factor like a deadline that forces them to. Regardless of the reasons for the bad choices, INTPs are going to be at their best when they're using their dominant and auxiliary functions to receive information and make choices based on that information. INTPs are dominant introverted thinking, and this is about attaining inner logical understanding of how things work. Their auxiliary or secondary function is extroverted intuition, and this is about generating ideas and possibilities. INTPs are therefore naturally independent and autonomous people, and in a relationship, they do need to have a certain degree of freedom in order to be satisfied. One theme that seems to ring true for many INTPs is that they don't necessarily feel the need to be in a relationship, and many are afraid of what being in a relationship could do to their independent nature, and I think this is especially true for younger INTPs. If an INTP gets into a relationship with a more controlling partner or one who's emotionally needy, this can actually cause a lot of stress to the INTP, and the stress can manifest in the form of rebellion. At the same time, spending too much time in their own heads, in their own world of introverted thinking, this isn't good either. If they're in a relationship, too much introverted thinking will run the risk of them not sharing or communicating with their partner or just neglecting the relationship. So therefore, I'd say that developing the inferior function of extroverted feeling is essential for healthy relationships and for balance. Extroverted feeling involves an active appreciation for other people, nurturing others, for example, which are areas that don't come naturally for INTPs, but they're still important developmental tools. INTPs, in my experience, do want to be appreciated for the great qualities they have, like fixing problems and their creativity, for example, but others won't necessarily know about how great these qualities are unless the INTP opens up about them. This is where gaining some balance with extroverted feeling can help. Some strategies for this are participating in social activities with people and activities they enjoy, sharing thoughts and ideas, and resisting the urge to get stuck in their heads. And I know my INTP listeners aren't really going to appreciate those strategies at first, but hopefully they'll see the value of them long term. One of my favorite sayings is, how you see yourself isn't necessarily how others see you. And this is so true for INTPs. They have a very unique way of looking at the world, and it often doesn't match what society deems appropriate, so when making decisions, there is some value to outside opinions.
That sounds like prudent advice. We all run the risk of assuming our way is the right way, and it's not always the case.
And just like any other Myers-Briggs types, INTPs have the potential to be great partners and to have wonderful relationships. A lot of their struggles likely have to do with facing their fears about emotional vulnerability. If they can achieve effective balance with this, they will be great decision makers.
So, switching gears a bit, our next question is out of the realm of romantic relationships. Kelly asks, I'm having trouble with some of the people I work with. What is the best way to try and introduce Myers-Briggs, or just understand the concepts a little better so I can appreciate what they bring to the table?
Great question. First off, it's the responsibility of the person most familiar with type theory and the Myers-Briggs type indicator to adapt to other people who are less familiar with it. So if Kelly already has a basic understanding of the four dichotomies, she can use this sort of as a springboard for interactions with her coworkers. I'm going to ask you, David, to bring up the URL for Myers-Briggs and Relationships and Overview, a brief description of the four dichotomies as they relate to relationships for our listeners. In interactions with her coworkers, Kelly will likely be able to gauge how open they are about learning about differences in terms of communication and work style, and this may impact whether or not she mentions the Myers-Briggs specifically. Some workplaces advocate for trainers to come in and give professional development sessions on the Myers-Briggs, and I do recommend this with a certified practitioner, preferably one who has experience working with workplace issues and communication strategies. Keep in mind that what's meaningful about this experience won't be each person's four-letter code, but what it means in terms of the relationship.
Yes indeed. The sort of difficulty Kelly may be talking about here may not have anything to do with Myers-Briggs. That would be fair to say, Edythe, yeah?
That's right, and we have to remember that the Myers-Briggs is only one lens through which to view human behavior. Much of how the information will be received will depend upon how it's presented. So I'd again like our listeners to be on the lookout for my upcoming article on appropriate usage and administration of the Myers-Briggs.
And that will be at www.atopcareer.com. It's also a great place for our listeners to sign up for the newsletter for more helpful tips. Now, let's move on to the next question. Mike is asking, are there certain Myers-Briggs types that communicate better with each other in a romantic relationship?
What an interesting question. Okay, let me start by saying that research indicates that effective communication is the single most important component of a satisfying relationship. And the more satisfied people are with the quality of their communication, the more satisfied they'll be in their relationships. Research that's published by CPP, who are the publishers of the Myers-Briggs as well as several other psychometric assessments, indicate that the more type preferences a couple has in common, the higher they rated their satisfaction with their communication. But this doesn't guarantee a satisfying relationship, of course. People with fewer preferences in common have to work harder at their relationships. And again, this doesn't mean that they're any less satisfying.
Can you provide a practical example?
So, using myself as an example, my boyfriend has ISFJ preferences and I have ENFP preferences. So in fact, we share only one dichotomy in common. So he and I definitely don't see the world entirely the same way. But I have to say, this is the best relationship I've ever had. And I've had relationships with ENFP men and men of other types who are more or less similar. Any way you slice it, you're going to have issues. Having issues doesn't mean the relationship isn't satisfying. There's just so much that goes into a relationship that the Myers-Briggs cannot and does not measure, and neither does any other personality assessment. So, many people who are familiar with the Myers-Briggs will unfortunately use it, as you mentioned earlier, David, as a determinant. And there's this idea of typing people, and it's a really big mistake, but it's something many of us are guilty of. We want to keep in mind that we all use our non-preferences, and we can train ourselves to work on these areas. For example, you, David, as an introvert, can train yourself to become more comfortable in large groups of people, but it might never be your preference to be in front of a large group of people. And the same concept applies to relationships. The Myers-Briggs doesn't measure attraction, love, or romance, but it can help in understanding other types and thus understanding other behaviors. And it can affect our communications and how we come across with others who have opposite preferences.
Some good reminders there for our listeners, Edythe. Now, the last question is another one I'm sure you've heard before. The question is from Debbie. Is it true that your Myers-Briggs will never change? For example, once an INFJ, always an INFJ.
Yes, this is a common question. Type theory suggests that type doesn't change. But as people, we are constantly changing. We're always growing and learning and using different parts of ourselves in different circumstances. Therefore, how our Myers-Briggs type manifests can and does change, and it is possible to develop behaviors or habits that aren't necessarily reflective of our Myers-Briggs preferences. So, as an example of this, I mentioned earlier my ISFJ boyfriend. As an introvert, it's really not his preference to approach people first and to be in large social gatherings, but life and his job has required that he do this regularly. And I have to admit, I played a part in this as well. So the result is that he's become a more balanced person as he's gotten older. And the same goes for me. As I've grown and developed, I've come to treasure my alone time much more than I did when I was younger. Everyone will likely see evidence of these changes on all four of their dichotomies. So I'd like to invite our listeners to listen to my podcast on this subject. Why did my Myers-Briggs type change? And David, if you can provide that URL for our listeners, that would be great.
Yes, there's the link on screen now.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Edythe. This has been really interesting, and I hope it's been useful for our listeners. Please do tune in for our future podcasts and sign up for Edythe's newsletter at www.atopcareer.com. I'm David from editbits.com signing off. Until next time. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you'd like to hear more, or you'd like to submit a question yourself, then you can find us at www.atopcareer.com. Until next time. MBTI and Myers-Briggs are registered trademarks of the MBTI Trust.